I entered the house after a long day at work, expecting to find the welcoming silence that usually welcomed me. Instead, I was greeted by a sight that made my heart soar. Chris and Ryan, my husband's best friends, were sitting on the sofa in the living room. They were laughing, and the complicit look between them was unmistakable. The suggestive smile on Chris's face made my stomach turn. "Hi, guys." I tried to sound casual, but there was a tremor in my voice. "Hi," Chris replied, getting up and walking towards me. He gave me a tight hug, perhaps a little longer than necessary. Ryan remained on the sofa, watching us with a look that seemed to carry a million secrets. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. What were they doing here? Jack didn't mention anything about having guests. "Is Jack in the office?" I asked, trying desperately to sound indifferent. "Yes, he asked us to wait here," Ryan replied, but there was a touch of malice in his voice that didn't go unnoticed. I sat back in the armchair, trying to process everything. How did I get to this point? The question echoed in my mind as I watched Chris and Ryan exchange glances. Everything seemed so normal, but at the same time, there was a tension in the air that was impossible to ignore. "Would you like some coffee?" I offered, trying to break the ice. "Sure, that would be great," said Chris, his smile leaving no room for doubt about his intentions. I got up and went into the kitchen, feeling their gazes following me. My heart wouldn't slow down, and I knew I was on the edge of a precipice. As I prepared the coffee, I couldn't help but ask myself, how did it all come to this? At what point did my life turn into such a complicated and dangerous plot? Walking into the living room and finding Chris and Ryan on the sofa was like being punched in the stomach. They were there, side by side, and the sight left me paralyzed for a moment. The complicit look they exchanged, and the suggestive smile on their lips, made my heart race like never before. I knew something was about to happen, something I hadn't anticipated, but which had been in motion for some time. "Hi, Sarah," said Chris, getting up and walking towards me. He always had a charming way about him, that charisma that made anyone feel special. "Hi," I replied, trying to keep my composure. Ryan remained seated, watching me with a look that mixed desire and defiance. It was impossible not to remember how it all began at Jack's last birthday party. Chris and Ryan had always been close friends of my husband, but that night, something changed. The attraction I felt for them was instantaneous, something I'd never experienced before. The animated conversations and subtle touches during the party made me restless, and the longing looks we exchanged were enough to ignite a flame inside me. "Are you okay?" Ryan asked, finally getting up and moving closer. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, feeling my face flush. The memory of the party was fresh in my mind, especially the risky decision to continue with the teasing. I knew I was playing with fire, but the excitement was irresistible. The first time Chris came to my house was on a rainy afternoon. Jack was at work, and I was alone, trying to ignore the nervousness I felt as I opened the door to him. When our lips met in the kitchen, the forbidden kiss was electrifying. Guilt hit me like a wave, but the intensity of desire was something I couldn't control. "Sarah, we need to talk," Chris said, pulling me back to reality. He looked serious, and I knew that this was a crucial moment. "About what?" I asked, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. "About us. About what we're doing," he replied, looking at Ryan for support. Ryan nodded, and the silence between us was filled with a palpable tension. I didn't know how it had come to this, but there I was, living a double life, torn between being Jack's wife and Chris and Ryan's mistress. "We can't go on like this," Chris continued, his voice low and urgent. "This is dangerous. For all of us." "I know," I admitted, feeling my heart squeeze. "But I can't stop." I don't want to stop. Ryan came over and put his hand on my shoulder. Sarah, we understand, but we have to be careful. Jack can't find out. The mention of Jack's name brought me back to reality. I was betraying the man I loved, and the guilt was overwhelming. But the desire I felt for Chris and Ryan was uncontrollable, something I'd never experienced before. I know, I repeated, my voice almost a whisper. But what are we going to do? Chris and Ryan exchanged one more complicit look before Chris answered. We need to be more discreet. We can't leave any traces. I nodded, knowing he was right. Betrayal was already part of my life, and accepting that reality was painful. But at the same time, there was an undeniable pleasure in living on the edge, in experiencing something so forbidden and intense. We'll be careful, I promised, looking at them both. But I don't want to stop. I can't stop. They nodded, and at that moment, I knew we were all committed to this dangerous game. The double life I was leading was exhausting, but the excitement of being with Chris and Ryan was addictive. As we sat on the sofa, the weight of guilt and uncontrollable desire mixed inside me. I was living an erotic and dangerous dream, and I didn't know how or when it would end. But for now, I was willing to continue, to explore the limits of pleasure and face the consequences later. Let's enjoy the time we have, Chris said, pulling me closer. Without thinking about tomorrow, and at that moment, I decided that's what I would do. Live in the present, without thinking about the consequences, because despite everything, the desire was stronger than the guilt, and I couldn't resist the temptation. The first time Chris came to my house was on a rainy afternoon. I was alone. Jack was at work as usual. The sound of the doorbell made me jump, and my heart raced. I opened the door, and there he was, with a smile that could melt anyone. Hi, come in, I said, trying to sound casual. Chris came in and took off his wet jacket. Thanks. This rain won't let up. We walked to the kitchen. I offered him a drink, and he accepted a coffee. As I prepared it, I could feel his gaze on me. The nervousness was palpable. My hands were shaking slightly. I tried to concentrate, but the tension between us was undeniable. We sat down at the table and started talking. We talked about trivial things, but there was an energy in the air that was impossible to ignore. He moved closer, and suddenly the world around me stopped. The first kiss was in the kitchen, a soft, forbidden touch. I pulled away immediately, guilt hitting me like a wave. Chris, we can't do this. Jack, I started to say, but he interrupted me. I know, but I can't help it, he said, his voice low and full of desire. I knew it was wrong, but something inside me yearned for more. We started seeing each other whenever Jack was at work. Each meeting was a mixture of guilt and pleasure. I couldn't stop. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt for years. One afternoon, while the rain was pounding on the windows, Chris showed up again. This time, the tension was unbearable. We kissed in the kitchen, but this time, there was no hesitation. His lips found mine with urgency. My hands slid down his body, and I felt the heat rising. We need to stop, I whispered, trying to regain control. I don't want to stop, he replied, his voice hoarse. At that moment, I realized that I was on a path of no return. The guilt for betraying Jack was intense, but the desire for Chris was even greater. I was torn between two worlds, unable to choose. Each furtive encounter got me more involved, and the line between right and wrong became increasingly blurred. Little by little, Chris's visits became more frequent. Every rainy afternoon, every night when Jack went out, I waited anxiously for him. Our relationship was a dangerous secret, a game I didn't know if I could control. One day, as we lay on the sofa, I heard Chris's voice, low and full of desire. I want more of you, he said, looking deeply into my eyes. "Me too," I admitted, my voice shaking. Guilt was a constant, but the will to continue was irresistible. I knew I was risking everything, but I couldn't stop. Chris had become an essential part of my life, a secret I kept with all my might. Every encounter was a challenge, a test of limits. With every kiss, every touch, I felt more involved, and the guilt, although present, was suppressed by the growing desire. I was on a dangerous path, but the thrill of experiencing something forbidden consumed me. Jack, oblivious to everything, continued with his routine. I pretended everything was normal, but inside, a storm was brewing. Chris was my secret, my addiction, and I knew that, sooner or later, something would have to change. But until then, I would continue to live this double life, trying to balance guilt and desire, without knowing where it would lead me. I can still clearly remember the moment when everything changed. I walked into the living room of my house and found Chris and Ryan on the sofa. It wasn't a normal sight. They were sitting very close, almost touching, and the looks they exchanged. There was something complicit and suggestive about them. My heart started beating faster, and I knew something was about to happen. How did I get to this point? The question echoed in my mind. It all started at my husband Jack's last birthday party. Chris and Ryan were close friends of his, and I had always seen them as part of our social circle. That night, however, something different happened. From the moment I saw them, I felt an instant attraction, something I'd never felt before. We talked animatedly all night, and every touch, every look full of desire, only increased that feeling. I remember being in the kitchen, laughing at a joke Chris had told, when our gazes met in a way that made my stomach turn. It was at that moment that I realized something had changed. I decided to continue with the provocation, even though I knew the risks. It was risky, but the excitement I felt made it all seem irresistible. The furtive encounters began while Jack was at work. The first time Chris came to my house was on a rainy afternoon. I was so nervous that my hands were shaking as I opened the door. He walked in, and the tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't long before we were kissing in the kitchen, a forbidden kiss that made my heart race. The guilt over betraying Jack was intense, but I just couldn't stop. After a while, Ryan joined in the dangerous game. He was introduced to our secret meetings, and the tension and desire only tripled. The first time the three of them met on the living room sofa was an overwhelming experience. I was living an erotic and dangerous dream, something I had never imagined possible. "This is crazy," I said, trying to control my breathing. "Maybe it is," Chris replied, smiling suggestively. "But that's exactly what makes it so exciting, isn't it?" Ryan just laughed, his eyes shining with a mixture of desire and amusement. The sensation of being there, between two intensely desiring men, was overwhelming. The tension between the three of us was almost unbearable, but at the same time, I didn't want it to stop. Every touch, every kiss, made me feel alive in a way I had never felt before. And although the guilt was always there, the excitement and pleasure were impossible to ignore. Looking at Chris and Ryan on that sofa, I felt a mixture of emotions: fear, desire, guilt, all at the same time. And even knowing the risks, I couldn't stop. It was like I was on a path of no return, and every step I took me deeper into this world of betrayal and infidelity. "Are you okay?" Ryan asked, his eyes worried. "Yes, I am," I replied, trying to smile. It's a lot to process. "If you want to stop, we can stop," Chris said, his voice soft and reassuring. But I knew I didn't want to stop. The desire I felt for them was overwhelming, and the idea of going back to my ordinary life without this excitement seemed unbearable. So I did the only thing I could do at that moment. I took a step forward, giving myself over completely to what was about to happen. And so, on that sofa in the living room, with Chris and Ryan by my side, I began to live an erotic and dangerous dream that would change my life forever. My heart was pounding as I crossed the hallway towards the guest room. Chris and Ryan followed close behind, the air heavy with the tension of what we were about to do. I knew I was overstepping all boundaries, but the excitement was irresistible. As soon as we entered the room, Chris closed the door behind us, shutting out the world outside. He pulled me close, and our lips met in a searing kiss. Ryan moved closer, his hands already exploring my body, and I felt completely enveloped by them both. "Are you sure about this?" Chris whispered, his breath warm against my ear. I just nodded, unable to form words. The guilt I felt for Jack dissolved in the desire that was growing inside me. I was determined to live this moment to the end, without thinking about the consequences. The caresses and kisses became more and more intense, and soon we were all out of our clothes. Every touch, every kiss, seemed to set my skin on fire. I was surrendered, without defenses, allowing Chris and Ryan to take me to places I had never imagined. "You're incredible," Ryan murmured, his eyes fixed on mine as his hands roamed down my back. The sensation of having two men desiring me like that was intoxicating. I allowed myself to forget everything, who I was supposed to be. There, in that guest room, I was just a woman looking for pleasure, and I was discovering the limits of what that meant. Chris and Ryan took turns, each exploring my body in different ways, but always in perfect sync. I felt like I was in a dream, an erotic and dangerous dream that I didn't want to wake up from. "You like that, don't you?" Chris asked, his voice husky and full of desire. "Yes," I managed to reply, my body trembling with pleasure. The hours passed without me realizing it. We were immersed in a whirlwind of sensations, fulfilling fantasies that I'd never had the courage to admit even to myself. Chris and Ryan spared no effort to please me, and I gave myself completely to them, leaving aside any trace of rationality. When we finally stopped, we were exhausted, but satisfied. Chris and Ryan lay down next to me, and the three of us sat in silence, catching our breath. I knew that moment would change everything, that there would be no turning back after what we had done. "You're amazing," Chris repeated, his hand gently caressing my arm. I closed my eyes, trying to commit that feeling to memory. I knew that reality would come knocking again soon, but at that moment, I just wanted to enjoy the feeling of having crossed all the boundaries of pleasure. "What now?" Ryan asked, the concern evident in his voice. "Now we go back to our lives," I said, my voice steady despite the internal chaos I felt. I got out of bed, searching the room for my clothes. Chris and Ryan did the same, and within a few minutes, we were all dressed again, ready to face whatever came next. As I left the guest room, I felt an enormous weight on my shoulders. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again, that I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But at the same time, there was a feeling of satisfaction, of having experienced something intense and unforgettable. "This doesn't have to be the end," Ryan said, his hand touching my shoulder reassuringly. "No, it doesn't," I replied, a shy smile appearing on my lips. As we said goodbye, I felt a mixture of emotions: guilt for betraying Jack, pleasure for what I had experienced with Chris and Ryan, and uncertainty about the future. But above all, there was the certainty that I had discovered a new side of myself, a side that could no longer be ignored. And so, I left the guest room, knowing that my life would never be the same again. The double routine of being a wife and a lover was consuming me in a way I could never have imagined. Every day felt like a dangerous game, a dance where every step had to be calculated so that Jack wouldn't get suspicious. I felt like an acrobat on a taut wire, trying to keep my balance while desire and guilt intertwined inside me. Jack had always been a good husband. He was attentive, loving, and hardworking. However, Chris and Ryan's constant presence in my life had changed everything. Feeling their touch, their penetrating gazes, their furtive encounters, it was like a drug I couldn't get rid of. I remember one particular morning when Jack was having coffee in the kitchen and I received a message from Chris. "This afternoon, at your house. I need you." My heart raced with anticipation. Jack looked at me and smiled, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. "Are you all right, love?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "Yeah, I'm just thinking about the shopping list," I lied, trying to disguise my nervousness. The excuses for being home alone became more and more frequent. I made up appointments, activities, anything that would give me a window of time to be with Chris and Ryan. And when we were together, the world seemed to stop. It was a pleasure I had never experienced before, a desire that burned intensely. I remember one particular encounter when Ryan arrived before Chris. We were in the living room, and I could hardly contain my anxiety. Ryan pulled me close, his lips meeting mine with an urgency that left me breathless. "We have to be quick," he whispered, glancing at his watch. "Chris is on his way." I just nodded, lost in the sensation of his kisses. When Chris arrived, the tension in the air only increased. We were all on the sofa, and their closeness made me dizzy with desire. Every touch was electric, every kiss a promise of more. However, with the pleasure came the growing paranoia of being discovered. I found myself looking over my shoulder, worrying about every sound, every movement. The possibility of Jack finding out was terrifying, and at the same time, that very possibility made it all the more exciting. I was torn between two worlds. On the one hand, the peaceful life with Jack, quiet dinners, routine conversations. On the other, the whirlwind of emotions with Chris and Ryan, secret meetings, intense moments of passion. It was like living two parallel lives, and I didn't know how long I could go on like this. One rainy afternoon, while Jack was at work, Chris came to visit me. The nervousness was there, as always, but there was something else. Guilt weighed on me like never before. "You look different today," Chris commented, looking at me with concern. "It's just difficult," I admitted, feeling the tears start to form, keeping it all hidden. "I love Jack, but I don't want to stop with you either." Chris pulled me into a hug, his strong arms wrapping around me. "We're here for you," he whispered. "But you need to decide what's best for you." I knew he was right, but making a decision seemed impossible. The desire for Chris and Ryan was overwhelming, but the guilt and fear of losing Jack were just as powerful. The encounters continued, and I became more and more skilled at lying and hiding the truth. I learned to disguise my feelings, to smile as if nothing was wrong. But inside, the storm only grew. The feeling of living on the edge, of walking a tightrope, was constant. And so my life went on, a mixture of intense pleasure and constant fear. I knew I couldn't go on like this forever, but for now, I was trapped in this dangerous game, not knowing how or when it would all end. I never imagined it would come to this. What started out as an innocent prank turned into something beyond my control. Jack believed that I was on a business trip and would never suspect the truth. The lie was carefully crafted, every detail thought out so that no loose ends were left. "I'm going away for the weekend, love. It's an important convention, and I can't miss it," I said, kissing him before walking out the door. He smiled, confident that his wife was only fulfilling her professional obligations. Adrenaline rushed through me as I drove towards the secluded cabin. Chris and Ryan, Jack's longtime friends, were waiting for me. I knew I was about to cross a line from which there would be no turning back. When I arrived, They were already there, smiling complicitly. "You've finally arrived," said Chris, pulling me into a hug that lasted a little longer than necessary. Ryan was standing in the doorway, watching me with that look that always took my breath away. "Let's go inside. We've got a lot to enjoy," he said, leading me into the cabin. The feeling of freedom was overwhelming. For the first time in a long time, I felt I could be myself, without judgment, without responsibility. The moments that followed were intense and unforgettable. Chris and Ryan knew exactly how to touch me, how to make me forget everything. "You're incredible," whispered Chris, as his hands explored every inch of my body. "I never thought I'd feel anything like this," I added between sighs, completely surrendered to the moment. The night was a mixture of passion and complicity. We laughed, we talked, we gave in to desire without any restrictions. At one point, Ryan looked at me seriously. "You know this is dangerous, don't you? We're risking everything," he said, his voice laden with concern. "I know," I replied, "but I can't stop. When I'm with you, I feel alive." The next day, we woke up together, curled up in the crumpled sheets. Sunlight streamed in through the window, illuminating Chris's sleeping face next to me. Ryan was in the kitchen, making coffee. When he saw me, he smiled. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty." "Did you sleep well?" he asked, handing me a cup. "Yes, I slept like I haven't in years," I admitted, feeling a twinge of guilt as I remembered Jack. We spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, enjoying every moment as if it were our last. The feeling of total transgression was always there, a constant reminder that we were playing with fire. "This is crazy," said Chris, as we walked along the trail. "But it's worth it," I replied, holding his hand tightly. When evening came, we knew that the weekend was nearing its end. "Tomorrow, we go back to reality," said Ryan, his voice sad. "But we still have tonight," I added, determined to enjoy every second. The last night was even more intense, a celebration of what we had experienced together. The next morning, as I drove home, the feeling of freedom began to be replaced by the weight of guilt. How would I look Jack in the eye after everything that had happened? Every kilometer I traveled brought me closer to the reality I had left behind, and the desire to return to the cabin grew. When I entered the house, Jack welcomed me with a smile and a warm hug. "How was your trip?" he asked, as he helped me with my bags. "Exhausting, but productive," I lied, trying to hide the whirlwind of emotions that was consuming me. Every time my cell phone vibrated, my heart raced, wondering if it was a message from Chris or Ryan. The text messages started to become bolder, recalling the moments we'd spent together and suggesting new encounters. At night, erotic dreams invaded my sleep, leaving me even more confused. The desire I felt for them grew every day, making it impossible to ignore. I knew I was living a double life, a routine of devoted wife and passionate lover. With each secret encounter, I felt more alive, but also more paranoid. The line between reality and fantasy was becoming increasingly blurred, and I didn't know how long I could go on like this. "Are you all right?" asked Jack one night, noticing my restlessness. "Yes, I'm just tired," I replied, trying to cover it up. But the truth was that I was torn between two worlds, unable to choose a path and fearing the consequences of any decision. The first secret trip with Chris and Ryan was a turning point. I knew I was risking everything, but the feeling of freedom and total transgression was irresistible. Every moment was etched in my memory, a constant reminder of what I could lose. Now, back in reality, the weight of guilt was overwhelming, but the uncontrollable desire pushed me to continue. I was trapped in a dangerous and exciting cycle, and I didn't know how to get out of it. When I got back from the trip with Chris and Ryan, I felt a huge weight on my chest. Reality hit me like a cold wave. Looking into Jack's eyes had become an almost impossible task. He welcomed me with that warm smile that always made me feel safe and loved. "How was your trip?" he asked as he hugged me. "It was tiring," I replied, trying to hide the guilt in my voice. The messages from Chris and Ryan kept coming. "Miss you," said one from Chris. "When are we going to see each other again?" asked Ryan. My heart beat faster as I read each message. Memories of our last night together invaded my mind, and I found myself caught between desire and guilt. The nights became a torment. I would wake up sweating after erotic dreams about Chris and Ryan. In one of these dreams, we were together again in the cabin. I could feel their touch, their kisses, their total surrender to pleasure. I woke up panting, with a mixture of excitement and regret. I looked at Jack sleeping next to me and wondered how I had gotten to this point. "Are you all right?" Jack asked one morning, noticing my tired expression. "I am. I just didn't sleep well," I lied. He kissed me on the forehead and left for work, without suspecting a thing. The days went by, and my desire for Chris and Ryan only grew. The text messages became bolder and bolder. "I can't stop thinking about you," Chris would say. "I want you now," Ryan would write. I replied, letting myself get carried away by the heat of the moment, even though I knew I was making a mistake. One afternoon, while Jack was at work, I received a message from Chris. "I'm passing by. Can we talk?" My heart raced. "All right," I replied, knowing it wasn't just a chat he wanted. When he arrived, we barely exchanged words. The attraction was palpable. "I missed you," he murmured, pulling me into a kiss. I knew it was wrong, but the feeling of being with them was addictive. I tried to push the guilt away, but it was always there, like a shadow that followed me wherever I went. With each passing day, reality and fantasy became more intertwined. Looking into Jack's eyes was difficult, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. The desire for Chris and Ryan was uncontrollable, and the guilt, although intense, wasn't enough to make me give up. I was living a double life, torn between devoted wife and impulsive lover, and with every meeting, every message, the line between these two realities became thinner, pulling me into an abyss I didn't know if I'd be able to get out of. I was at home, tidying up in the kitchen, when my cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Chris. "We need to talk. Can we do it in Jack's office tonight?" My heart raced. The idea was completely insane. My husband's office? But at the same time, the adrenaline rush that this proposal brought made the blood pulse faster through my veins. I thought for a moment and replied, "Okay, I'll be there at 7. I could hardly believe what I was about to do, but the excitement was irresistible. I spent the rest of the day nervously trying to act normal around Jack. I could barely look him in the eye, feeling the weight of guilt and excitement at the same time. At 6:30, I told Jack I was going to the supermarket to pick up a few things. He didn't suspect a thing, just asked me not to be long. I left the house with my heart in my mouth, driving to his office. The building was almost empty, just a few lights on here and there. I entered carefully, trying not to make a sound. When I reached Jack's office door, my heart was beating so fast it felt like it was going to explode. I opened the door slowly and walked in. Chris was there, sitting in Jack's chair with a mischievous smile on his face. "You came," he said, getting up and walking towards me. "This is crazy, Chris. If anyone catches us here..." My voice was shaky. "But no one will catch us, and you know you want this as much as I do." He put his hands on my waist, pulling me closer. I felt his warmth, and for a moment, all my fears disappeared. Before I could respond, he kissed me. It was a kiss full of urgency and desire, and I gave myself over completely. My hands were in his hair, pulling him closer as our bodies pressed against the office table. Suddenly, we heard a noise. My heart almost stopped. "What was that?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. "It's probably just the wind," Chris replied, but his eyes showed a little concern. He pulled me closer again, as if to make sure we didn't lose any more time. "We need to be quick," I said, trying to control my breathing. "I don't want to run the risk of someone finding us here." He nodded and started kissing my neck, his hands exploring my body. The sensation was incredible, and for a moment I completely forgot where we were. Only the pleasure mattered. "This is so wrong," I mumbled, but I couldn't stop my own movements. My hands were on his belt, unbuttoning his pants. "Wrong, but so good," he replied, with a wicked grin. "And you know it." The surrender was total, with no thought for the consequences. Jack's office, which had always been a place of work and seriousness, now became a stage for our forbidden desire. The feeling of living on the edge, of defying all the rules, was intoxicating. When we finished, we lay on the floor, trying to catch our breath. "That was incredible," said Chris with a satisfied smile. "Yes," I agreed, but the guilt began to weigh heavily on my chest again. "But we need to be more careful. We can't risk that much." He held my face with his hands, looking deep into my eyes. "I know, but what we have is special. It's worth the risk." We left the office as quietly as possible, each going our separate ways. In the car, on the way home, my mind was a jumble of emotions. Desire still pulsed strongly, but guilt was also there, reminding me of what I had just done. I got home and Jack was in the living room, watching TV. "Took you long enough," he commented, without taking his eyes off the screen. "The supermarket was full," I lied, trying to sound casual. He didn't suspect a thing, just asked me to sit next to him. As I sat down, my cell phone vibrated again. A message from Chris. "It was amazing. I can't wait for next time." I smiled, but inside, a whirlwind of emotions was consuming me. I knew I was playing with fire, but the excitement and pleasure were irresistible. From that moment on, my life became a dangerous dance between being the devoted wife and the passionate lover. And although I knew it could explode at any moment, I couldn't, or perhaps didn't want to, stop. I wake up every morning with a feeling of emptiness in my chest, a mixture of guilt and excitement that has become my constant companion. Betrayal has become a shadow that accompanies me, a secret that consumes me from the inside. With each secret encounter, the flame flares up a little more, and I find myself trapped in a cycle of desires and lies. I don't know when exactly I started to become an expert at lying. Perhaps it was when I realized that Jack, my husband, trusted me blindly. He had always been the perfect husband, always present and loving. But even with all this dedication, something inside me yearned for more. And that's when Chris and Ryan came into my life. Chris and Ryan were Jack's close friends. They were always around, at parties and weekend barbecues. It was impossible not to notice the chemistry between the three of us. At first, it was just furtive glances, subtle touches during conversations. But over time, these little signs turned into something more. I remember it like it was yesterday. Jack had left for work, and Chris showed up at our house on a rainy afternoon. Nervousness overtook me as I opened the door to him. "Hi, can I come in?" he asked, his voice husky with desire. I knew I should refuse, but I found myself unable to resist. "Of course, come in," I replied, trying to keep my composure. In the kitchen, while we were preparing coffee, our hands touched. The first kiss was forbidden, but at the same time, unavoidable. Guilt consumed me, but desire was even stronger. "We need to stop," I whispered between kisses. "I know," he replied, but neither of us made any move to pull away. Ryan joined us shortly afterwards. The tension and desire tripled. The first three-way on the living room sofa was something I'll never forget. "This is crazy," I muttered, my voice shaking. "I know," Ryan replied, his eyes shining with excitement. "But it's good crazy," Chris added, smiling. From that moment on, betrayal became a constant part of my life. I made excuses for being home alone, and secret meetings became more and more frequent. Jack, poor thing, never suspected a thing. I became an expert at lying, at hiding the truth. "You look great today," he'd comment, and I'd just smile, while inside, guilt ate away at me. Living with Jack continued peacefully, while I lived a parallel romance with Chris and Ryan. It was as if I had two separate lives. On the one hand, the devoted and loving wife. On the other, the passionate and transgressive lover. "You're never going to stop, are you?" Chris asked once as we lay in bed. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I don't know how to stop." Accepting that betrayal was part of my life was a gradual process. At first, I tried to fight it, but over time, I realized that it was part of me. I knew I was wrong, that I was hurting Jack, but the truth was that I couldn't stop. "You're going to end up destroying yourself," Ryan said once, worried. "I know," I replied with a sad smile, "but I can't stop." The continuous betrayal, the double life, became my new reality. Each secret encounter kept the flame burning, the ability to lie and hide the truth becoming more and more refined. "You're good at that," Chris once commented in admiration. "Unfortunately," I replied with a sigh. I knew that one day it would all end badly, but until then, I would continue to live in this cycle of desires and lies, unable to stop, unable to resist temptation. "You'll end up getting hurt," Ryan repeated several times. "I know," I always replied, "but I can't stop." And so the betrayal continues. The double life persists. Every day is a new challenge, a new lie. But at the same time, every day is a new opportunity to live a little more of this madness that consumes me. And for as long as it lasts, I'll continue to be Jack's devoted wife, while living a parallel romance with Chris and Ryan.